The thing about standing near the gates of Buckingham Palace on any given morning is that everything looks the same. That's the point, really. The guards are supposed to be statues, immovable, part of the architecture almost, and most days they are. But I was there the morning one of them wasn't. I need to back up. My name is Daniel Hargreaves. I'm a secondary school history teacher from Sheffield, and in the spring of that particular year, I'd brought a group of Year 9 students down to London for a 3-day educational trip. Museums, Westminster, the usual circuit. On the second morning, we had a free block before our scheduled National Portrait Gallery visit, so I took the kids down to the palace. Not for anything special, just to let them see the guards, watch the ceremony, maybe get some photographs for their portfolios. Standard stuff. 43 teenagers, 2 teaching assistants, 1 very underpaid me, and a sky that couldn't decide if it wanted to rain or not. We arrived around 9:30. The pavement in front of the gates was already thick with people, tourists mostly, the kind who arrive early with proper cameras and folding maps. A few families, some solo travelers, a handful of school groups like ours arranged in loose clusters behind the railings. The guard on post that morning was stationed to the left of the central gate. I noticed him the way you notice any of them, tall, bearskin hat, scarlet tunic, the whole picture-perfect image, face like carved stone. His name, I later found out, was Corporal James Aldrin, but at that point he was just the guard to me, the same way he was to everyone else standing there. I positioned our group a reasonable distance back from the front. The more eager kids immediately pressed forward, phones out, trying to get close-up shots. I reminded them, loudly, because reminding teenagers things quietly is a waste of air, to stay behind the barriers and to respect the space. The weather that morning was one of those cool, overcast London mornings that manages to be bright and gray at the same time. Not cold enough for proper coats, but too cool for just a jumper. That particular kind of English spring that can't quite commit. The tourists had that look people get when they're slightly underdressed but too proud to admit it, arms folded, shoulders hunched, still managing to smile for photographs. I remember the sounds clearly, the distant hum of traffic from the mall, the occasional helicopter somewhere above, the low chatter of 40 different languages mixing together into a kind of ambient noise like a radio between stations. Pigeons, always pigeons. For about 20 minutes, nothing unusual happened. Corporal Aldrin stood at his post exactly as he was supposed to. I watched him the way I always watch the guards, with a sort of quiet admiration I'd never quite say out loud, because there's something genuinely impressive about that level of stillness in a human being. The man did not blink more than was necessary. He did not shift his weight. He stared straight ahead with the focused blankness of someone who has trained themselves to be present without being reactive. My students predictably tried to make him laugh. This is what Year 9 students do. A boy named Marcus walked up and pulled a face approximately 6 inches from the guard's helmet. 2 girls tried whispering things. Another kid, I won't name him, but he knows who he is, actually attempted a slow, theatrical wave directly in front of Aldrin's face. Nothing, not a flicker. The kids retreated, moderately impressed despite themselves. And that's when I first noticed the little girl. She was standing, or rather, hovering near the far edge of the crowd, maybe 7 years old. 8 at most. Dark hair pulled into 2 braids, a yellow raincoat that was slightly too big for her, the kind a parent buys with growing room in mind. She had a small backpack, purple, with a cartoon rabbit on it, and she was holding the strap of it with both hands, up near her collarbone, the way children hold things when they're uncertain. What caught my eye wasn't her age, or the coat, or even the fact that she was alone. It was the way she was watching the guard. Not the way the other children were watching him, with that mix of excitement and mischief, waiting for him to crack. She was watching him with complete, unbroken focus. The kind of focus that in a child looks almost out of place, because children don't usually hold still long enough for their eyes to carry that kind of weight. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't frightened either exactly, but there was something about her face that made me pause, something careful in it, like she was calculating something. I told myself she was just a quiet kid. Some children are. I turned back to my group, reminded a boy named Finn to stop leaning on the railing, and mentally reviewed our schedule for the afternoon. But I kept glancing back at her. She hadn't moved, she was still watching the guard, and now she'd done something slightly strange. She'd raised one hand slowly up near the side of her face. Not waving, not pointing, just holding it there. Palm slightly open, fingers spread then closed, then spread again, slowly, deliberately. I frowned. One of my teaching assistants, a woman named Priya who has sharper instincts than I'll ever have, appeared at my elbow. Dan, she said quietly, nodding toward the girl. You see her? I'm looking, I said. Where's her adult? I scanned the crowd around her. The people nearest to the girl were a group of American tourists, middle-aged couple, matching camera straps, absolutely absorbed in photographing the gate. A Japanese family a few feet further, two backpackers who didn't seem to be with anyone. None of them were looking at the child. None of them seemed connected to her. The girl did the hand thing again. The same slow open and close, looking directly at the guard. And then I saw something that made the hair on my arms stand up. The guard saw it too. He hadn't moved, his head was still forward, his expression was still stone, but his eyes, and this is the detail that I keep coming back to years later when I tell this story, his eyes had shifted. Just slightly. Not a turn of the head, not a flinch. The most fractional, controlled movement of the eye line I've ever seen in a person. He was looking at her, and the girl, this quiet, careful little girl in the yellow raincoat, held his gaze and did it again. Open hand, fingers spread, slow close, open again. I said to Priya, something's wrong. She was already moving toward the girl. But here's the thing I didn't expect. Here's the part that made this day different from every other school trip I've ever run. Before Priya reached her, before I could even properly process what I was watching, the guard moved. Not toward the girl, not yet, but he moved. A small, deliberate step to the right which shifted his angle just slightly without breaking his formal stance. And then with the same controlled precision he'd used to stand completely motionless for 40 minutes, he turned his head a fraction of a degree, then 2, then 3, until he was looking directly at the girl with both eyes, not just the edge of one. The crowd didn't notice. Why would they? He was still standing at his post, still perfectly upright, still wearing that expression that gives nothing away. To the 40 tourists around him, he was still a statue. But he wasn't. He was listening. The little girl's hand dropped. She looked at him for one more long second. And then, and this is the moment I struggle to describe without sounding like I'm dramatizing it, because I'm not, she mouthed something. Not a sound, just the shape of words, slow and deliberate, the way you speak when you need someone to understand without anyone else hearing. I couldn't read lips, I don't know what she said. But Corporal James Aldrin did. And whatever she mouthed to him in that quiet, careful, 7-year-old way of hers changed the next 20 minutes of both their lives. And honestly, of mine too. He held his position for approximately 4 more seconds. I counted. I don't know why I counted, but I did. And then in the most controlled, purposeful way I've ever seen a human being do anything, he stepped off his post. Not a stumble, not a break, a step. One step, two, moving toward her. The crowd reacted the way crowds always react when something breaks from the expected slowly, then all at once. There was a ripple of murmuring. People looked around, unsure if what they'd just seen was real. A few phones came up. Someone behind me actually said, "Did he just?" Yes, he just did. He crossed the distance between his post and the little girl in about 8 strides. He didn't run. He walked with the same measured, upright posture as always, back straight, bearskin steady, everything exactly proper. Except that he was somewhere he wasn't supposed to be, moving toward someone nobody else had noticed. He crouched down in front of her. And this is the image I can't get out of my head, even now. This enormous man in full ceremonial dress, the bearskin hat making him look almost impossibly tall, folding himself down to her level on the pavement like it was the most natural thing in the world. Getting his face close to hers, saying something quiet. The little girl's chin wobbled. And then she pointed. She pointed toward the far end of the crowd, to the right of the main tourist cluster, near a section of the path that runs along the edge of the gate toward the corner. And standing there, I hadn't noticed him before, I don't think anyone had, was a man. He was wearing a dark green jacket, mid-40s maybe, heavyset. He was looking at his phone, or pretending to look at his phone, and he was standing just far enough from the main crowd to seem separate from it without being conspicuously alone. Corporal Aldrin looked where the girl had pointed. Then he looked back at her. He said something else, she nodded. Her chin was still wobbling, but she was holding it together the way some children do, with this incredible fragile dignity that makes adults feel slightly ashamed of how easily they fall apart. Aldrin stood back up. He kept one hand, gentle, positioned at the edge of the girl's shoulder, not touching her but close enough that she could feel he was there. He reached for the radio clip to his uniform. There was a brief exchange. Quiet. I couldn't hear the words from where I was standing, only the crackle of a response. Whatever he said, it was short and precise. He then turned his body, just slightly, so that he was positioned between the girl and the man in the green jacket. And he waited. The whole thing, from the moment he stepped off his post to the moment backup arrived, took about 4 minutes. It felt longer. Everything always feels longer when you're watching it happen and you're not sure what it is yet. 2 Metropolitan Police officers arrived from the direction of the mall at a pace that was efficient without being panicked. A woman in plain clothes came from the opposite direction, speaking quietly into an earpiece. The man in the green jacket saw them before they reached him. He didn't run. He started to walk, quickly, shoulders tight, the specific body language of someone who has decided that the best option is to pretend they're going somewhere they were always planning to go. But the officers were faster and more practiced at reading that particular kind of walking than he was at doing it. I watched them redirect him, firmly, with the practiced calm of people who do difficult things every day without making a scene. He said something, they responded. One officer took his arm. He didn't fight, he just deflated like something went out of him. The woman in plain clothes had gone straight to the little girl. She crouched down too, mirror of Aldrin, and spoke to her softly. The girl was crying now, properly crying, the held breath kind that comes when the thing you were scared of is finally over and your body stops needing to be brave. She was nodding at whatever the woman was saying. Corporal Aldrin stood nearby. He'd moved back not far, but enough to give space, enough to let the professionals do their work. He was standing straight again, back in his posture, but he was watching the girl, not the crowd. After a few minutes, an older woman came running from somewhere behind the tourist cluster, came running in that breathless, coat-flapping way that parents and grandparents run when they've lost sight of a child and found them again. The girl saw her coming and let out a sound, one of those sounds children make that has everything in it at once: relief, fear that had been waiting, love, and just sheer exhaustion from keeping it all in. She ran and they collided, and the older woman held her so tight I had to look away. My teaching assistant Priya was standing next to me. I hadn't noticed her come back. She had her arms folded and her jaw was tight, the way it gets when she's trying to hold her face together. "Right," she said after a moment. "Yeah," I said. Neither of us had anything better than that. I found out later, pieced together from conversations with one of the police officers who stayed on scene, and later from a brief statement released through official channels, some of what had happened. Not all of it. Some of it's not mine to know. The little girl's name was Rosie. She'd become separated from her grandmother in the crowd about 20 minutes before Corporal Aldrin noticed her. In that time, the man in the green jacket, who was known to authorities, though the specifics were never publicly shared, had approached her twice. The first time, he'd crouched down and spoken to her. The second time, he'd taken hold of her wrist for a moment before releasing it when a group of tourists walked between them. Rosie hadn't screamed, she hadn't run. She'd done something much more precise than either of those things. Her mother, this came from the grandmother later, passed on through the officer, had taught her something. A signal, not complicated, not something that required a phone or a loud voice or anything that could be stopped or taken away. Just a hand signal. A slow open and close of the palm, held near the face, used when you need help but can't ask for it out loud. Her mother had taught her to use it if she was ever in trouble, and to aim it at whoever was in charge. The person who looked like they were supposed to protect things. Rosie had looked at the crowd and found the most obvious person she could. The one in the uniform, the one standing at the gate like his whole job was to keep people safe. She'd been right. And Corporal Aldrin, who had been trained to stand still no matter what, who had been trained to treat his post as absolute, who had been standing at that gate through rain and heat, and every tourist London had ever produced, had seen a child signal for help and had chosen, without hesitation, without ceremony, to be a human being first. He stepped off his post, which, if you know anything about the regulations governing Royal Guard duty, you understand, is not something that happens lightly. There are specific, enumerated circumstances under which a guard may leave position. A child in silent distress, spotted through a crowd, is not in any written manual. But he went anyway, because some things are more important than the manual. The crowd didn't disperse quickly. That's the thing about a moment like that, it lingers in the air even after the principals have left. People stayed near the gate, talking to each other, comparing what they'd seen, pulling out phones to show each other footage they'd caught in the last few seconds. There was that particular kind of energy that gathers after something serious has been quietly averted. Not the chaos of an emergency, but the low, charged hum of people who have just realized they were standing next to something real. I kept my students together. This took effort. 14-year-olds have an almost magnetic attraction to anything involving police officers, and several of my group were pressing forward, straining to see what was happening near the gate. I got them moved back with a combination of authority and bribery. I promised them an extra hour at the gift shop, which I would later deeply regret. Priya stayed near the front of the group, watching the scene continue to unfold. The man in the green jacket had been moved away from the main tourist area entirely, walked toward a vehicle that had arrived quietly from the far end of the mall. 2 officers went with him. No drama, no raised voices. The kind of handling that happens so smoothly it almost doesn't register as serious until later, when you replay it and realize what you were actually watching. The woman in plain clothes, I'd later understand she was a family liaison officer, though I didn't know the term at the time, stayed close to Rosie and her grandmother. The grandmother hadn't stopped holding the girl. She was sitting on one of the low concrete barriers near the pavement with Rosie on her lap, despite clearly being too old and too small for that to be comfortable, rocking slightly. The kind of rocking that has nothing to do with soothing a child and everything to do with soothing yourself. The liaison officer crouched beside them, speaking in a low, steady voice. At one point she offered something. I couldn't see what, possibly just a tissue, possibly something for the girl to hold, and Rosie took it and pressed it against her face. Corporal James Aldrin was back at his post. This is the part that struck me most, and I've thought about it many times since. There was no fanfare, no acknowledgement from the crowd that had been looking at him, no ceremony of return. He simply walked back to his position with the same measured stride he'd used to leave it, reassumed his exact posture, and became still again. Just like that. The crowd, still buzzing with conversation, barely noticed. Because why would they? He was back where he was supposed to be, which meant, in the collective logic of a tourist crowd, that nothing had happened. Except it had. I watched him for a long moment. His face had returned to its professional blankness. Expression controlled, eyes forward. Everything about him was, to outward appearances, exactly what it had always been. But he wasn't watching the middle distance the way guards usually do. He was watching the edge of the crowd, specifically the area near the barriers where the grandmother and Rosie were still sitting. Not obviously, not in a way a tourist would clock, but I was standing at an angle where I could see his eye line and I could see what he was doing. He was making sure they were all right. Keeping an eye on them without making it visible, without making it something that required anyone to thank him for. I found that, and I realize this is a strange thing to say about a man standing 40 feet away in a bearskin hat. I found that almost unbearably decent. My students eventually got bored, which is what Year 9 students reliably do after approximately 12 minutes of anything that doesn't directly involve them. Marcus asked if we were going to the gallery now. Finn asked if there was anywhere nearby to get a sausage roll. A girl named Jade, who had been watching the scene near the barriers with genuine interest, asked me quietly, "Sir, is that little girl okay?" "I think so," I told her. "I think someone made sure she was." Jade nodded and looked toward the guard. "Is that what they're for?" she asked. "Like actually for, not just the standing there?" I looked at Corporal Aldrin. Still at his post, still watchful. "Yeah," I said, "that's what they're for." We moved off toward the gallery about 10 minutes later. I did one last head count, 43 still, and as I turned to follow my group, I looked back at the gate. The grandmother had stood up now. Rosie was on her feet, held against the grandmother's side with one arm firmly around her. They were preparing to leave. The liaison officer was walking with them, still talking, directing them gently toward the street. But before they moved, Rosie turned back. I don't know if she was looking for the guard, or if it was just the natural backward glance of a child leaving somewhere, the kind they do without quite knowing why. But she turned, and her gaze went straight to where Aldrin was standing. He didn't wave. He didn't nod. Technically, he couldn't. He was at his post, and his post demanded exactly the stillness he was maintaining. But I was watching, and I saw what happened. For the briefest moment, the length of a single breath, his eyes found hers. And his expression, that carved stone professional mask, shifted by almost nothing. The smallest possible version of an acknowledgement, not a smile, not quite, but something in the set of his face that said, "I see you. You're all right now." Rosie stared at him for a second. And then she raised her hand, just her right hand, small and deliberate near the side of her face. Palm open, fingers spread. Not the distress signal this time, just the hand held toward him. He looked at it for one beat. And then, with the precise economy of a man who gives only what he can and nothing extra, he closed the fingers of his own left hand, down at his side, barely visible, the smallest possible gesture, into a slow, quiet close. Then open again. Then nothing, eyes forward, post resumed. The whole exchange lasted about 4 seconds. I have never, in 20 years of teaching children, and watching the ordinary moments of ordinary days accumulate into what we call a life, seen anything quite so small feel quite so significant. The story might have ended there for me, a remarkable morning, something I'd tell at dinner parties. Something the kids would half remember and half exaggerate in the way teenagers do, turning it into something bigger and louder than it was because they don't yet know that the quiet moments are the ones that last. But it didn't quite end there. About 3 weeks after the trip, I received an email through the school office. It had been forwarded from the Palace Visitor Coordination Team, a roundabout route that took some explaining in the covering note, and it was from a woman named Philippa Oakes. Rosie's mother. She wrote to say that she'd been told, through the liaison officer who'd attended that day, that a teacher from Sheffield had been present and had been watching from a close distance when her daughter was noticed. She said she'd hoped to reach him to say thank you, though she understood if he preferred not to respond. She said she hoped his students were well. She said her daughter was well. She said that the man in the green jacket, she didn't name him, and I didn't ask, had been known to police. That the situation that morning had been, as they say in official language, resolved satisfactorily. She thanked the Metropolitan Police. She thanked the liaison officer. And she thanked the guard. She wrote, "I taught Rosie that signal when she was 5. I never really believed she'd need it. You spend so much time teaching children what to do in situations you're desperately hoping they'll never be in. And then one day the worst thing happens, and they're standing in a crowd of hundreds of people, and somehow the right person sees them." She wrote, "I don't know if you can pass anything on, but if you can, please tell him that she's been sleeping better since, that we both have." I forwarded the email through the same channel it had come in on, with a note saying I wasn't sure who would see it, but that it was intended for the guard who had been on duty that morning at the central gate. I don't know if it reached him. I like to think it did. There's something I've turned over in my mind many times since that day, and I'll try to put it into words, though I'm not sure I'll do it justice. We talk about soldiers and guards as if their defining quality is their stillness, their immovability. The ability to become something almost mechanical, to stand in the face of noise and provocation, and weather and crowds and feel nothing, show nothing, be nothing except the post they are standing at. And there is real skill in that, real discipline. I am not diminishing it. But what I watched that morning was something more specific and, I think, more difficult. Because Corporal Aldrin didn't abandon his stillness out of impulse. He didn't break his post because someone shouted or shoved or made a loud, obvious scene. He broke it because he was paying attention. Because through 40 minutes of crowd noise and student misbehavior and pigeons and pavement and the endless visual chaos of a tourist morning in London, he had noticed one small girl in a yellow raincoat doing something quiet with her hand. He noticed because he was looking for things worth noticing. That seems to me like it might be the harder skill, not the standing still part, though God knows that requires enough. But the part where you are so completely present, so genuinely alert beneath the stillness, that you catch the thing no one else catches. The thing that doesn't shout. The thing that doesn't run. The thing that just raises its hand near its face and opens its palm slowly and hopes that someone is actually there. Rosie's mother taught her that signal because she knew there would be noise. That in a real moment of danger, the instinct to shout is often too frightened to function. That a child alone in a crowd might not be able to make a sound. So she gave her daughter something smaller and quieter, something that could cross a distance without traveling through the air. And Corporal Aldrin was quiet enough inside his discipline to receive it. That feels important to me. The way two kinds of quiet found each other across a crowded pavement, the quiet of a trained man holding still, and the quiet of a frightened child holding on, and made something happen that all the noise in the world couldn't have made happen. In the weeks after our trip, I used the morning as a case study in one of my Year 9 history lessons. Not the incident specifically, Rosie's story isn't mine to share in a classroom, but the broader question it raised. I put it to my students this way. What does it actually mean to be on duty? What are you there for? Marcus, predictably, said you're there to follow the rules. Finn said you're there to protect people, because that's what the job is. Jade, who I'd noticed had been quietly thoughtful since the trip, said something that stopped the room a little. She said, maybe you're there for both, and sometimes you have to choose which one matters more. And the answer is probably different every time. 14 years old. I told her that was a better answer than most adults would give, which made her go slightly red, which I felt bad about because teenagers hate being praised in front of people. But she was right. Corporal Aldrin had been there for both, the post and the person, the rule and the human need that the rule in all its written precision had never quite anticipated. He'd chosen, and he'd chosen correctly. I've been back to Buckingham Palace since. Twice, in fact, once with another school group, and once on my own, during a week off in autumn when London was doing that thing it does where the light goes gold, and everything looks like it belongs on a postcard. Both times I walked past the gate, I looked at whoever was on duty. I don't know if it was ever him again. Guards rotate, and I'm not good enough with faces to be sure. But I looked, the way I always look now, not with a half-absent tourist glance, not looking for a photo opportunity. I look the way you look when you understand that the person standing there is actually, actively watching. That the stillness isn't absence. That the eyes behind that stone expression are moving, cataloging, sorting the crowd for anything that needs to be caught. It changes the way you see them. Or at least it changed the way I do. There is a version of this story that gets told incorrectly. I've seen it online, fragments of it, passed from account to account, gaining details in the telling the way stories do when they pass through too many hands. In some versions, the man in the green jacket is described differently. In some versions, the girl is older, or younger, or the location shifts entirely. In one particularly embellished account, someone claims the guard physically restrained the man himself, which is not what happened, and is probably not something that would have been appropriate regardless of how dramatic it would have made the story. I want to be clear about what I actually saw. I'm a history teacher. Accuracy matters to me, probably to an annoying degree. What I saw was a guard who noticed a child, stepped off his post to reach her, called for assistance through the proper channels, positioned himself as a barrier between her and the person she was afraid of, and then returned to his post and continued his duty. It is not a story about heroics, exactly. Nobody tackled anyone. No one was physically harmed in the space of those 20 minutes. The resolution was quiet and procedural and handled by trained professionals doing what trained professionals do. What makes it extraordinary, and I do believe it is extraordinary despite and maybe because of its quietness, is not what Aldrin did, but what he noticed, and what he chose to do with that noticing. In the face of 40 years of institutional training telling him that his feet do not move, that his eyes stay forward, that his post is absolute, he looked at a child's hand and understood something. That's the story, that's the actual thing. And I think it matters because it's a reminder that discipline, real discipline, is not the same as rigidity. That following the spirit of something is sometimes more important than following the letter of it. That rules are made by human beings to serve human purposes, and that a person with genuine integrity knows the difference between a rule that serves its purpose and a moment when the purpose has to come first. Corporal Aldrin understood that. In 8 seconds, without fanfare, without anyone asking him to, without a single guarantee that he was right or that it would go the way he hoped, He made that judgment and acted on it. I spoke to a retired officer once, not connected to the incident, just someone I ended up in conversation with at a function, the way you do, who told me something I've held onto since. He said the hardest thing they ever trained for was not the physical endurance, not even the emotional control, but what he called selective attention. He said, anyone can learn to ignore everything. That's just practice. The hard part is learning to ignore everything except the thing that matters, being able to filter 100 things at once and still catch the one that needs catching. Most people, even well-trained ones, pick a level. They either watch for everything, which exhausts them, or they shut down and watch for nothing, which protects them. The good ones learn to do both at the same time. They're resting and they're ready every second. I thought about Corporal Aldrin when he said that. Resting and ready. 40 minutes of crowd of tourists of my Year 9 students doing their worst, of pigeons and pavement and grey London light, and somewhere underneath all of it, his attention had stayed precisely calibrated, not frantically scanning, not switched off into the middle distance, just there in the way that genuinely present people are there, in a way that's increasingly rare and, I think, increasingly valuable. Resting and ready. And when Rosie raised her hand, he was ready. A few months after our trip, I applied for, and somehow got, a small Arts Council grant to run a personal documentary project. It wasn't anything professional. Just me, a decent microphone, and the idea that I wanted to collect first-hand accounts from people who'd had unexpected encounters with moments of quiet courage in public spaces. Not dramatic rescues, not headlines, the smaller things. I interviewed 7 people over the following year. A paramedic who'd spotted a stroke in a pub. A bus driver in Bristol who'd noticed a woman being followed and had found a way to delay his route without making a scene. A schoolgirl in Leeds who'd recognized a classmate's drawings as a cry for help and had told a teacher instead of keeping quiet the way peer pressure usually demands. I interviewed myself in the end. Just me talking to a camera propped on a stack of books in my living room, trying to describe what I'd seen at the gates of Buckingham Palace on a Tuesday morning in spring. When I got to the part about Aldrin crouching down in front of Rosie, I had to stop and reset. Twice. Which I found embarrassing and then decided not to be embarrassed about, because it was the honest response, and I'd made a promise to myself that the project would be honest. I aired the documentary at a small community screening in Sheffield. About 40 people came, which I considered a success. One woman stayed afterwards to tell me that her son was currently serving in the military and that she was going to send him the recording. She said she wanted him to know that it was possible to be exactly what you were trained to be and still be human at the same time, that it wasn't a contradiction. I told her that was exactly what the project was about. She seemed satisfied with that. She left. I packed up the projector and drove home in the dark and thought about Rosie's hand. There's something specific about London in the way it crowds people together without connecting them. You can stand shoulder to shoulder with hundreds of strangers in front of one of the most famous buildings in the world and still be entirely invisible to every single one of them. Tourists are, by their nature, focused outward on the architecture, on the shot, on the experience they came to have, not on each other. Not on the small, quiet, difficult things happening in the space between them. Rosie knew this on some instinctive child's level. She knew that shouting might not help, that running might make things worse, that the crowd was big and loud and not paying attention, and that the ordinary routes to safety, the visible, noisy ones, were not available to her. So she found a different route. She looked for the one person who was not a tourist, the one person who was not there for himself, not distracted by his own purpose, not oriented toward the building or the experience or the photograph, the one person who was there entirely for other people, whose function, whose whole trained reason for being in that space was to notice and to protect. And she told him in the quietest possible way that she needed help. I think about this a lot in the context of teaching. The students in my classroom who need help but will never ask for it directly. The ones who signal in small ways, through their work, through their silences, through the particular quality of their attention when something is wrong. The art of catching those signals is not something anyone teaches you formally. You develop it over years or you don't, and the ones who don't miss a lot of children who needed to be caught. Corporal Aldrin had that art. Maybe it came from training. Maybe it came from years of standing still and having nothing to do but observe. Maybe it's just who he is. But he had it. And I've been trying since that morning to be a little more like him in that specific way. Not the standing still part. I'm a secondary school teacher. There is no standing still, but the genuine, calibrated attention. The willingness to notice the quiet thing. The one that isn't making noise because it can't. The last thing I want to say about this, and I've been working toward it for a while now, is about the signal itself. Rosie's mother taught it to her when she was 5. A slow open and close of the palm held near the face. Simple enough for small hands, visible across a distance. Impossible to misread as something ordinary. I don't know where the mother learned it, or if she invented it. I've read since that there are established silent distress signals, hand signals used in domestic violence situations, in hostage scenarios, in circumstances where vocalizating is not safe. The general concept exists in several forms across different contexts. But I don't think the specifics matter as much as the principle. The principle is this: sometimes the person who needs help cannot make a sound. And the right response to that, the only adequate response, the response that Corporal Aldrin understood instinctively, is not to require the sound. Not to wait for the shout or the wave or the obvious signal that the situation is actively preventing. To be alert enough, present enough, calibrated enough to receive the quiet signal instead. That principle applies in more places than a palace gate on a Tuesday morning. It applies in classrooms and offices and hospitals and families and friendships and every other place where human beings try to be near each other. The number of people in the world who need help and are not able to ask for it clearly is, I think, larger than most of us assume. Being the kind of person who catches the quiet signal is one of the most useful things I can think of to be. Rosie would be older now. About 12, I'd estimate, if my arithmetic is right. Old enough to remember what happened that morning, or at least to have been told the story of it. The way we are all eventually told the stories of the days when we were too young to fully hold them ourselves. I wonder if she still knows the signal. I imagine she does. I imagine her mother kept it, even after that morning, or maybe especially after that morning. The day the thing you prepared for actually happened and the preparation worked. I wonder if she knows about Aldrin. If she understands, with the fuller comprehension of a 12-year-old rather than the pure instinct of a 7-year-old, what it meant that he stepped off his post. I hope she does. I hope she understands that she was seen, not by chance and not by luck, but by a man who was specifically trying to see, who had made the choice, in his training, in his character, in whatever combination of the two produces someone genuinely worth trusting, to be the kind of person who catches the thing that doesn't make a noise. She raised her hand in a crowd of hundreds. He was the one who was looking. That's the whole story, really. Everything else is just what happened around it. I still take school groups to London occasionally. It's less frequent than it used to be. Budgets, logistics, the general administrative weight that settles on everything in schools over time. But we go. And every time we pass the gates of Buckingham Palace, I slow down a little. I look at whoever is on duty. I tell my students, not always, not every time, only when it feels right, that the person standing there is not decoration. That the stillness is not emptiness. That there is something happening underneath the uniform and the hat and the stone expression that is worth paying attention to if you know how to look. Some of them listen. Some of them have already moved on to thinking about the gift shop. But some of them look, the way I look now, not at the building, but at the person in front of it. And once in a while, one of them asks me why. And I tell them about a Tuesday morning in spring. About a yellow raincoat and a purple backpack and a small hand moving slowly in the cool London air. About a man who stood still for 40 minutes and then, precisely when it counted, chose to move. About the fact that sometimes the most important thing a person can do is simply be present enough to notice. Rosie's mother said her daughter had been sleeping better since. I hope she still is.